Hey guys, Danky here. I kind of wanted to pick up where I left off on the last video where I was talking about socialism and climate change. Uh, like in the last video, I'm kind of going to peek into my crystal ball and sort of predict what will become of the world in the coming age of climate change. But rather than focus on specific like geopolitical locations, specific countries, I want to focus more on just um, the overall effects that climate change will have on terrain. Um, Last episode, we talked a little bit about uh, brackish water, which is the process uh, resulting from ocean water rising due to melting ice caps, and this oceanic salt water percolates down into the water table and uh, salinates the uh, water table. And of course, is a huge amount of uh, high density metropolitan cities built along these uh, coastal regions which have access to fresh water. Think about cities built uh, along rivers yet close to a coastline. It's in these types of areas, therefore, we can expect to see the effect of climate change take into effect. But there are lots of other uh, regions of the world which will be heavily impacted. And one I wanted to really talk about was um, the Pacific Islands, or just islands in general. Uh, we can already sort of see some of the Pacific Island nations are trying to negotiate with countries like Australia to allow their people to come over as refugees, or at least some of them to come over as refugees, because they are already anticipating mass waves of migration due to climate change. So we see small, extremely isolated and undeveloped regions in the regions of like Papua New Guinea. I know in the regions of like the Philippines, there are communist rebels, um, and then places like India, which, although of course not an an island, is still in that sort of region of the Pacific Indian Ocean region. Um, but there are many islands which are very small, um, and they will certainly uh, and they are also they have very low topography, and so they are at particular risk to sea level rise. And for a lot of these countries, it's simply not economically feasible to build a seawall around your entire island. So, uh, and in many cases, these places are although they may be represented by a single dot on a map, in real life, they may have hundreds or thousands of small islands in these archipelagos. So that is to say, the amount of land is going to shrink, uh, and particularly the amount of habitable coastal land is going to shrink. There's a general principle that climatologists look at that shows that, the further inland you go, generally the more arid a region gets, especially if that region's like broken up by a large mountain range that separates it from the ocean. So, large desert regions uh, will now be sort of at the forefront of the coast once the sea level rises. When that happens, you'll find a lot of new coast along land that is um, not nearly as fertile, and especially once the real warming conditions of climate change get into effect, which is and desertification, which is the next real challenge I wanted to talk about. So we talked about how brackish water uh, threatens countries uh, that are high density metropolitan areas that rely on fresh water near a coast. We talked about how island nations are threatened by sea level rise, but now we're going to talk about something called desertification. Um, and this is sort of a interesting phenomenon. We can actually see this happening in the southern Sahara Desert in a region called the Sahel. Um, and you have to understand that vegetation, grass, roots, trees, plants in general, and the bugs and the worms going uh, in the soil helps strengthen that soil and solidify it and keep it from turning into like that grainy sand that blows freely in the wind. And so once you have just sand being blown in and no vegetation to catch it, well, then the sand is just going to keep blowing, and thus you lead to a resulting gradual catastrophe known as a desertification event. So, in lands adjacent to vast sandy deserts, such as the regions of Arabia or northern Africa, they are going to be faced with vast difficulties. Areas throughout the Middle East are going to be faced with very vast difficulties. They're going to have to, unless there are just extremely massive, like civil development projects that go into place um, to sort of protect certain territories and sort of creates safe zones and buffer zones to protect from this desertification. You're not really going to have uh, very many options when it comes to fertile land, especially in regions like the Middle East, where uh, not only do you have to contend with the growing deserts, but also the growing heat. And indeed, many climate scientists believe to this day that uh, there will be certain regions of the Middle East that will be completely uninhabitable once global warming completely kicks into effect. So, what role does this have to play for our conception of the future world that we discussed in the past video, the world where it's divided between sort of a new socialist front that forms as a result of climate change in the third world versus this sort of ultra nationalistic fascist bloc that formed out of the modernized nations as a attempt to sort of uh, 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 hoard their resources and keep the unwashed foreign hordes out. So you have like these two dynamics at play, but what you would also have is a dynamic of climate imperialism. Um, and I want to really look at what the definition of imperialism is. So, in order to do that, I think I will split this video into two parts. So, In this first part, we talk about the climate change effects on this sort of future world, and in uh, in the age of climate change. And in the next video, we will talk about the role of imperialism to play in this age of climate change. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for watching.